Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our next Human Capital Watch, or today's Human Capital Watch. And our subject today is human capital, basically is human capital analytics dead in the water because of GDPR. And I'm really glad you've chosen to join us today. I'm assuming that if you have done so, it's because you have a particular interest in human capital analytics. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So in fact, what we're going to be doing is covering some key questions here about what are the challenges the GDPR, that is the General Data Protection Regulation, I won't say that again, raises for people who are in charge of human capital analytics. What are the benefits that it might offer to them? How are companies addressing both compliance issues with GDPR, but also preserving some of the power and the potential of human capital analytics to deliver business value? Because that's really the central dilemma that we're going to talk about today. And then finally, what do we see as the future of these same issues? Data privacy, human capital analytics, big data, et cetera. So that's the overview of what we're going to do. On your screen, you're going to see information about how to download the presentation, how you'll be able to watch this again or share it with your peers by downloading it, how you can look at this webcast full screen. But what I really want to call to your attention is the question pod and say it helps us a lot if you'll ask questions in real time as they occur to you. I'll be monitoring those so I can either interject them as right then, or perhaps hold them till later in the webcast. But please don't hold up on those. We really will be looking for them. And then I also want to mention that you have opportunities, as you may know, to get continuing education credits. There's information here on each of the types that you could get, but the important caveats for you is you need to stay online for the whole webcast. And that credit is only available to those of you who are watching live with us today. So I want to introduce our presenters. I'm Mary Young. I'm Principal Researcher for Human Capital at the Conference Board. And I've been working for more than a decade on issues like strategic workforce planning, human capital analytics, and big data, and digital transformation. And with two colleagues, including one of our speakers, Marion Devine and Amy E., have now done a series of reports on GDPR. The first one, what it means about human capital data in general. And this one, I'm going to do a shameless plug, which was published last week and which you can get on our website, focuses specifically on human capital analytics. One of my co-authors is here speaking to us from the UK, Marion Devine, who's Senior Researcher for Human Capital Research. She's on your right, I believe. And on our left is Leandra Griep, who's Organizational Development and Human Capital Analytics Specialist from the Merck Group. And she's speaking to us from Germany. Great. So this is a topic that is, you almost can't read a publication today without hearing somebody sound off about GDPR and what it means. More often, though, they're talking about what it means in terms of customer data, marketing data, but we are all interested in what it means in terms of human capital data, whether that is about our employees, our contingent workers, our applicants for jobs. And frankly, there's much less written about that, which is why we think it's so important to learn more about it and share what we learn. So I thought it would be helpful, since we have viewers from all over the world, Leandra, if you could just give us a quick overview of Merck.
Definitely happy to do so. And thanks for having me here today, Mary. So yeah, to start with, really, I would like to introduce you a little bit to our company and who we are. So we are Merck, and we are a global leader in science and technology. And yeah, not only by the colors, you see that we are a really vibrant company, really changed quite a bit since the last years and decades. And today we are present in the areas of healthcare, life science, as well as performance materials. And we have a really wide product range. So you could find us in the area of such as cancer therapies, but also in the area of laboratory tools, and on the other side, really on products that you would find in your daily life, like really liquid crystals within your smartphone, or the color of your ice cream, or even the color of your car. So quite a wide product range that we have today. And actually, this year Merck had a large celebration. So we celebrated our 350 years anniversary. So quite some history we went through, and we started in the early days really with a small pharmacy in Darmstadt, and now really we truly became global since then, with being present today in 66 countries with more than 52,000 employees worldwide. And yeah, just as some facts on the right side, you can see here that yeah, we are known as Merck globally, except for North America. So we need to point that out, as there is another Merck out there within North America. You would know us under the umbrella of EMD Serono, for example, Millipore Sigma, or EMD Performance Materials. Just to clear that out.
Yeah. Okay. That's a helpful overview, and I think it's particularly exciting that we have with us a human capital analytics expert who comes from a German company, a German-based company, because as everybody in the world of human capital analytics knows, nobody has set the bar higher in terms of data privacy than Germany. And when we hear global companies talking about GDPR, it's always, well, what will will be okay in Germany? So I think it's great to have somebody who's sort of on the inside of that. And I think we can learn from seeing how they do it in Germany. One of the things that we heard when we interviewed companies and subject matter experts around the world about GDPR is we heard a whole range of responses. Everything from, the sky is falling, absolute panic, all the way along a continuum, people said, oh, this is just another Y2K. We had people who just said they were going to be much more cautious in their human capital analytics, or they knew that their legal and risk people would tell them they had to do that. And then we had those who said, you know what, actually, in the long term, this is going to be good for human capital analytics. And so we're going to sort of talk about that whole continuum and share with you some of the insights that we got from our research. So to begin, I'd like to turn to Marion and ask you, most people on the call are pretty familiar with GDPR, and because we don't want to just focus on the regulations, but rather what you can do to address them without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and losing the value of human capital analytics. You're going to do this, I think, at a very high level. And if anybody wants to read more, we've got lots of detail in our 2 reports.
Yeah, so looking at our slide, Mary, thank you. I think I just want to say that we had a great opportunity, Mary, myself, and our colleague Amy, to work with our Human Capital Analytics Council in Europe. They've been really generous, and it was a wonderful opportunity to really talk with them about what they thought about GDPR. And there are quite a lot of challenges about it. The first thing to do is to just really clarify for anyone that has any doubts. If you process personal data within the EU and the European Economic Area and Great Britain, because it will comply, you come under GDPR. And if you're outside the region, it's the location of your data subject that's the real decider. So if they are within this region, then you come under GDPR. So it's a big challenge for most of multinational companies and a lot of our members. And I think that certainly talking to our council, they were really sort of concerned of is GDPR going to constrain many of our current practices? Is it going to require us to work in quite new ways? So just briefly, there's no doubt that some human capital analytical practices will have to stop, and there'll be a lot of questions about the legalities of others, and there are some big concerns about, for example, how much data you can sit on top of, what's essential, what's non-essential. There's questions about legitimate business purpose, and I will sort of talk about that on the next slide. But in the meantime, we've really heard the message that GDPR really puts human capital analytics under the spotlight in a way that's really new and something that practitioners really have to get to grips with. It does invite closer scrutiny because of the increased opportunities for missteps, given the fines, the complexities, and there are still a lot of unknowns. So human capital analytics is under the spotlight. It's not just from external regulators, but people within the company, including legal, risk, data governance, internal audit. All these people will be looking. Works councils and unions are already closely keeping an eye on GDPR. And I think what we've seen from our research is that while closer attention is a challenge, it can possibly benefit human capital analytics in the long run, because actually it makes GDPR data protection a board level priority. And so human capital analytics has to come out of its tower if it's in one, and if it's under the spotlight, outside of the spotlight, it has to come into the spotlight. So big challenge ahead. And we know that this closer scrutiny could lead data governance leaders to overreact and just tighten the reins on human capital analytics too much, and therefore really limit the contribution of this discipline. So that's something that human capital analytics people are going to have to really work with and really make sure that their companies understand the business value, and they're not going to just say, it's too hard, we're not going to do it. So the other aspect that we're aware of is that there's every possibility that GDPR will give data protection advocates something that they can really use to really demand transparency and accountability for companies, and companies are going to have to work with that. And there's also the possibility that, I suppose you'd call them trolls, will be using GDPR. We've seen that with customers. There's a question mark, will employees want to use the regulations to really fight a case with their company, or use that data to argue, for example, if they were unlawfully dismissed, they may well have new sort of ammunition at their disposal. So this is a new reality that human capital analytics needs to be aware of. And we've had some of our members talking to us privately, very openly, honestly, that if you have a difficult relationship with your European Works Council, then data protection principles such as consent and legitimate purpose can become quite hot topics, and they've had to be very ready to really discuss that and to explain what they want to do and why. So moving on to the next slide, some of the very specific challenges to human capital analytics, and I think in order of priority in a certain way, is this the question of legitimate purpose. Companies have to demonstrate that they have a legal, justifiable purpose for processing personal data from their employees, contingent workers, from applicants. And they can't just collect data for one purpose and then use it for something totally different. If they are going to use it again, it has to be a compatible purpose. This is quite a difficult area for companies to navigate through. They have to be really clear about their purpose. They have to be very clear if the next purpose is closely linked. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be closely linked? So, for example, can you hang on to someone's resume and use it for in your talent pool for future job postings? Well, I think you're going to have to ask permission and make that very explicit. So that's a challenge. Another big challenge is data minimization. Companies just can't collect personal data because it's nice to have or because more is better. And yet, again, when you talk to practitioners, that sort of sense of, yes, it's more is better is very ingrained into their thinking, I think. So, the new law requires that personal data be limited to what is necessary to achieving a specific and legitimate business purpose. And that has to be factored in right from the word go in anything that you do. Data retention. Well, again, this is very difficult. GDPR restricts how long you can keep data, but it doesn't really make it clear what is the appropriate time to keep data. But it does make trend analysis, which is one of the most basic and useful insights for human capital to do. It makes trend analysis potentially tricky. It makes the use of historical data potentially tricky. It also casts a big question mark over predictive analytics. And then the right to
I just wanted to interject here. You, Amy, and I spent a lot of time, and we spoke to a lot of legal experts in order to to really understand what these regulations meant. And one useful distinction, perhaps, is I think to understand the difference between what we call essential HR data. That's the kind of data that HR has to collect, companies have to collect as part of the employment process, as part of employment regulations. So this doesn't, of course, mean that you can't hang on to performance data or data about people's age or education or et cetera. But it's about these, what we're calling non-essential, the kinds of extra data that human capital analytics provides a strong reason for wanting to have and use. It's those discretionary kinds of data that this applies to. I just wanted to clarify in case there was any.
Absolutely, Larry. And actually, I'm thinking about it in a way. Diversity and inclusion to me, is a sort of an example of that. When it comes to demographic data for equality purposes and equal pay and everything, it's clear that you can keep that data. But if you're keeping data to look into inclusion, that's a whole different set of personal data. So yes, I think you're right. One is essential data, and the other is the rich type of data that HR is increasingly looking at and calling upon for analysis. So yes, and just to sort of really finish up, profiling has to be augmented by human input. And so obviously anyone that's using machine learning as a sole means to make a decision can't do that anymore. You have to have meaningful human interaction. So those are just some of the basic challenges of the GDPR, which really means that human capital analytics people are really going to have to think how to navigate through these.
And these, as we've said, they really sort of hit HCA people where they live and where it hurts. So I know that we're going to hear from you now, Leandra, about how you've been responding to this, what you've put in place at Merck in order to meet GDPR requirements, but also to continue to have a job in doing human capital analytics and getting the value out of that. But before we do, I thought it'd be interesting to ask you, because you are a German-based country and you've been operating under some of the most rigorous data protection regulations even before GDPR, were there any particular new challenges, new demands that GDPR imposed above those that you had already been complying with in Germany?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing was that, with this, law that we have already in Germany, which is really strict already in terms of data privacy, we had actually already quite, a really good basis in order to already comply to GDPR. It was rather more that, we had to, again, revise our documentations, go into all these processes to comply with GDPR, but it was not that we had to change our operating model, our technology or anything like that, and we had not to amend it due to GDPR.
Lucky you. But I think that that's helpful to know, and I think that the people who are listening to the webcast now can actually, most of whom won't be in Germany or aren't in Germany, can learn from what you have in place at Merck. So could you take us through that, please?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the good thing is really that when we started at Merck to roll out people analytics, I mean, that was already 3 years ago, right? So we have now 3 years of experience with all the data privacy law in Germany, and now we're basically ready to then go and comply to GDPR. And to be totally honest with you, I'm really in the luxury of having also a great organization and legal department at Merck in Germany, and actually also with a global structure in place, and that helped a lot. And the partnership really with the data privacy office in general overall is really key in that point. Yeah, and I mean, I landed up here a little. What are the required steps in order really to comply to GDPR? To give you some more insights on that, and happy to interrupt in case you want to hear more. if I'm too quick on certain aspects. So to start with, it's really key that whenever you have a human capital analytics or another technology that you want to bring into place, of course, first thing what you would need to do is really register into a data privacy register. And for that, we do have at Merck a system in place. We do have certain templates that we can use, and of course a data privacy officer that helps us to really do the important formulation, do the right clicks in order to really be able to do human capital analytics still and comply at the same time to data privacy. But I'll refer.
Could your data protection officer at that point say, "No way, you're not going to do that"?
Yeah. So in the beginning, we had a couple of discussions. Like, I mean, and first of all, the biggest question was, I mean, why do we need this? Yeah, and why do we need all tons of data? You know, it was quite interesting actually, because the data privacy officer in the beginning asked me to line out, well, what are all the reports that you could generate with your analytics technology? And I was just saying, like, oh, honestly, I mean, I couldn't even name all the possibilities that we have, because we have today like over 90 million data points in our technology. You can correlate them in so many different ways. So how could you then also come up with like one common purpose in order to explain and have the legitimate interest and purpose defined that would explain that you can just use it in this aspect of big data, and just start digging into, and Marion just named it also, or use machine learning for that. We are not that far yet, but it's also coming. And we had to have a couple of discussions to figure out the best and balanced way to be, on the one hand side, really flexible in what we can do with our technology today, and on the other hand, be specific enough in order to really comply to GDPR.
So can I just ask you a clarifying question? You say you have over 90 million data points. Is that just human capital data? Or is that all? And can you just give us a few examples of the kinds of data that is?
Yeah, definitely. So today we have integrated basically all our HR master data from SAP, like headcount allocation, role level structures, all of that, compensation data, and we do have also our process data in there, like recruiting, performance, succession planning, and we do also have included external data like our global engagement survey. We run once a year, benefits data. Yeah.
Okay. That's really helpful.
Definitely.
I was wondering, actually, could we ask you for a kind of an example when you were saying about sort of trying to get this balance between flexibility in what you do and also being specific enough to comply with GDPR? Is there a sort of an example that you could give us?
Yeah. So what we did is then basically have kind of data clusters defined. So one data cluster would be recruiting data, and then we define clearly, okay, for recruiting data, what would be the question a manager usually would like to or would be able to answer with the help of our people analytics technology. And it might be then correlating recruiting also again with other data points, of course, and other data clusters. But really to come to start with that point, to really frame, what could you do with the recruiting data, starting really to look at, time to fill, open positions, kind of dashboarding data, to then also correlating the data to answer, for example, are we hiring the right people, looking at performance, etc., and really to frame out the most common questions you could answer that would bring also value again to the business.
That's great. You can see if you get pause at this, because Marion and I can never stop being researchers, and we're taking notes on what you say.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll just remind people we're watching for your questions.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, and so yeah, one really most important thing is really this, to define this specific but at the same time flexible purpose, right? So there, it's really a good partnership with data privacy, and of course other things that are involved in this data privacy process is that you do a certain privacy impact assessment, and to really see, you know, what kind of risks are out there, and have kind of mitigation plans in place. And you may know that also from other technology forms that you would need to fill in, and you would need to define like technical and organizational measurements, things like that. And of course, as we also, from one day to the other, we really had a global go live. So we have, of course, also had to deal with international data transfer and the processing of our data, and not only, you know, working with internal data transfer and processing, but actually also transferring data to our external vendor, things like that. And for that, of course, there are certain standards that you need to use and comply with again. And of course, all the time in the end, and we luckily did not have any case yet for any data breach, but we also do have really a process and mitigation plan in place in order to really then know what to do whenever there is a data breach, and really to report that to our data privacy officer directly.
One of the things we hear from our colleagues in risk management practice at the conference board is that it's often very hard for a company to tell right away that there has been a data breach. So the requirement that you report this in 72 hours is, I mean, is that an issue you're concerned about?
No, I wouldn't say concerned, you know. I mean, there's always a certain risk, of course, you know. But as long as you know what to do whenever you really discover this data breach, it should be good and should be sufficient to then react within the 72 hours. Yeah. But of course, I mean, when GDPR was introduced now in May, I mean, to be honest, everyone was kind of running around also at Merck, really to see, you know, what impact does it have on our technologies and tools. And we really, of course, in order to, you know, limit the risk of getting to these personal data breaches at all, of course, what we have done in the last month and year is really to assess every single tool that we have and HR process even, in order to be really ready.
Does it mean if you talked about having a specific purpose in mind, you know, use for the data? It just occurred to me that to ask whether does GDPR require that HCA or HR or whoever keep a closer control over access to the data, so that a manager, for example, doesn't use the data for an analysis that you weren't intending? I mean, could that happen, or do you have controls for that?
Yeah, no, that's really a good point, and I think we're also ready to move to the next page on really more specifically talking about people analytics in more depth. So one large thing and what we are really known for at Merck and in our people analytics function is that we actually did make our people analytics technology, and we built and designed it basically for our global managers. And today, 3,500 global managers at Merck do have access to this technology. And yes, I mean, this is huge, and this was really a prey from HR side, I would say. And the good thing is that with the technology that we have today, we can really steer for each single data point. We can say who would be able to access the data, also if whether this would be aggregated only or really on individual employee basis. And this helps a lot, of course. And the good thing is also that within the cloud technology that we have today, also we make it really easier for everyone in HR, but also in the business to collaborate on analytics and on the analysis that you do actually within the cloud technology. You can share them within the cloud, and you can be assured that only those folks that have the same access rights that you have will see the same data, and it will automatically, you know, apply to your user profile, and you would only see the data that you are allowed to see. And that makes life really easier, because earlier, even within HR, like business partner often came to me, "Oh, Leandro, I don't know, am I allowed to show this in the next leadership meeting?" You know, things like that. And now, you know, we have one-time exercise to have really a global access management implemented just once, and then we can be sure that it's in the right place.
So that's using technology to control access. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, also to answer your question on what they then actually do with the data, because to be honest, they do have really access to a broad range of data at Merck. So we do help them actually to also to find a way on how to get started with people analytics. So we have some kind of standard analysis that we share globally with all management. And then on the other side, we do run enablement sessions, either virtually or face-to-face with our manager and HR business partner together in a room to really make them at ease, make them really feel comfortable in working with the data. Of course, also touching topics like data privacy in those sessions.
Thanks.
Could I just ask Leandro just one question? If you had to say for you where you are in your journey of data protection, and obviously you're quite well ahead in a sense because of the German higher standards. But is there sort of one challenge that for you as companies has been the hardest when it comes to GDPR? Is there something that you think that's a really bit that's hard for us?
Yeah, I would say especially now, and that's, well, maybe not in particular for people analytics only, but really for HR in general, is now the right for every individual, to be able to also ask for deletion of data, right? And to really have processes in place that could guarantee that records would be, within a certain time really be deleted for this individual. And it took us really quite a while to also say, well, there are some data points, and you mentioned it earlier, that it's actually the company needs and is required to keep even after employment. So for example, for during retirement, for pension, things like that. So there are certain data points we actually can't delete, but which we of course have legitimate purpose in place, so we would be still allowed to use. But it's quite some effort in order to really ensure that from all the systems that we have, that this would be gone. Then
have you had many requests from employees to be forgotten?
Yeah. So far, not from internal employees, but from external candidates, we received some requests. Okay. Yeah, and that was still easier because then you only had the recruiting platform basically, so it was easier to deal with that. But it was a good first experience. Yeah, definitely. Great.
So you're going to talk some more about this slide?
So yeah, and And basically, a couple of things here are on the slide are also German specific. So when and that's why maybe I'll only touch them. And if you are have more interest, I'm happy to dig deeper. But basically, when we introduced people analytics as a global technology at Merck 3 years ago, yeah, we of course had to run through all the data privacy processes, but we also did have to deal with a so-called ITK in Germany. So that's an IT commission, and it's partially so members of that commission are the IT security team, the Workers' Council, HR representatives, and of course data privacy. And this is actually a really good commission that we have here, because you only need to go there once and you can ask for approval from all the parties. But as you can imagine, there are certain rounds you go up front with every individual party of that commission, basically, in order to start the discussion, have really early involvement of all the parties, especially also the Workers' Council in Germany, in order to be really, transparent, open with them. And I think that's really key when we implemented people analytics at Merck, to be really successful in having a good outcome.
How was your relationship with the Works Council in general before you got into HCA?
I would say quite good. We do have really a good partnership in Germany. And this, of course, makes it easier, because we always in advance, even, sometimes we have them already updated, even if we're only talking about prototypes or little tests, and even providing the Workers' Council access to our technology so that they actually can really, see and feel what we do and what we try to accomplish. And this transparency and open partnership really builds trust. And I think that really helps.
I would think that for companies, HCA is relatively new, and now Works Councils are aware of it. They have a say in it, and I would think that a fair amount of HCA leaders' time has to initially be spent, as you said, you gave them access. It's a great idea, but in building their understanding, because nobody knows about this stuff unless they've actually used it.
Yes.
So there's an educational component, I would think, that was really important.
Yeah, no, that I think that helped the most, to really show them, provide them even the access, so they actually can also assess themselves, the German population here for Merck, and really know how to deal with it, participating in an enablement session together with the business managers to really see, what's actually the purpose, the value of this technology, and that really drove it. Yeah.
Great.
And of course, except from Germany, there are also other Workers' Council out there. So I only named the most relevant countries that we dealt with when we implement technologies like our HCA in general. Germany, of course, is one large country there, but also France has a huge Workers' Council with and the so-called right for co-determination that applies in that case, which needs to be, of course, you need to highly engage with them and get their approval, as well as also for Italy and Spain, and recently also I've had first touch points with South Korea, and there is also a specific council called Labor Management Council, and they also in South Korea do have a really large right of personal data privacy and asking for employee consent, looking into topics like that. So
we have an audience question, Leandra, and this is from someone who asked, can you tell how you, excuse me while I read this, but how you are handling the collection of sensitive data, especially in light of an employer's inability to obtain valid consent from employees because of the intrinsic power imbalance in the employment relationship.
Mm-hmm. So what we do, I mean, whenever you start at Merck, basically you already sign a consent that we are able to use your personal data for, of course, HR specific processes and relevant processes. So that's kind of one-time consent that we request, and then throughout actually those stakeholders like the Workers' Council in Germany, actually we do, I mean, they kind of present our workforce, and whenever they approve and you know, engage in the code elimination right, then that is sufficient from data privacy in order to make use of the data and collect them. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Have you talked about, I don't think you've talked about the international data transfer, or have you?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and maybe that also gets into the direction of the last question. So of course, what's also important here is that we do process data Merck group wide. So we have more than 200, you know, legal entities and 66 countries. So what's also important is that we actually obtain the right from each of the legal entities that are out there in order to process the local data centrally in Germany or from Germany. And for that, we do have actually a so-called group data transfer agreement in place. And every managing director from each legal entity basically signed this contract. And this, is another, supports as well also this global consent question. Yeah.
Thank you for that level of detail, which I think is really helpful to companies who are trying to work this out for themselves, and it's not starting perhaps from an advanced position as Merck is. So we have limited time, and so Marion is going to just very quickly go through, and you can read much more about it in our report and get further detail about some of the ways we found in our research. These will echo some of the things that Leandra has described, some of the ways companies are responding to GDPR in light of their human capital data.
Yeah, and I think actually, you know, there are a lot of companies out there that are not in the enviable position that Merck is, and that this is very much the start of the journey for them, and perhaps some of them have been caught out a little bit. We've seen 3 short-term coping mechanisms, and I think it's obvious that they are short-term. So some companies have just moved the location of their processing activities. So people like Facebook and LinkedIn have stopped processing their global users' personal data in Ireland or in the UK, and they've moved it to California, where the laws for the minute are less stringent. So not ideal, but that's what some companies have done. If they really feel they're just not ready, they've simply moved their processing activities for their non-EU customers or employees. The second one is we heard companies talk to us about trying to define legitimate purposes as broadly as possible. And one human capital leader said we need to find wiggle room in how we define our initial purpose. Big question mark. Is that going to wash with EU regulators? Maybe not, because the law does say the purpose must be specific. And I think if you stretch it too widely, you might get into trouble. The third coping mechanism is just saying, let's cut out EU data from our human capital analytics. And that obviously is not ideal, but that's what some companies are doing. And they are therefore obviously going to have some skewed results, but they think that is better than not doing the analytics at all. So longer term, that tactic's not going to be very effective, I think, especially as other regions do adopt similar data protections. So those are the short-term mechanisms. Do you want me to go on to some of the longer?
Yes, please. Again, we'll probably have to treat them pretty briefly.
Very briefly. Really briefly, companies are doing obvious things like aggregating human capital data, which therefore means that they're getting data at the enterprise or group level. and they can do with that. They can anonymize, but it's quite hard to really be sure that it's completely anonymized and Loctite. But the GDPR does favour pseudonymization of human capital data, and so that's where you have artificial identifiers such as encrypted codes. So companies are definitely going down that route. They are also combining things like profiling and human intervention. So they are using AI to reach decisions, but also putting in other layers of decision making. So, for example, ING, when they combine certain functional groups, they used an algorithm, but they also built in employee self-assessment, managers' assessment, personal interviews with employees, and really made sure, therefore, that it was a sort of multi-graded decision-making. Another one is really that just to minimizing personal data, the companies are sort of saying, look, if we can actually really talk about benefits, then that really helps to say why we're doing this, and it will lead to outcomes and actions, and we really need to just keep that focus on action. So I think those are sort of the main things that I would say, Mary. And I think overall, we also found that companies just said, take a risk management approach, just look at the worst case scenarios, be prepared for that. And I think human capital analytic teams also have to be part of that effort. And finally, I think what our council really spoke to us about was having a code of conduct. Leandro's talked about building trust, and that was a really important message, build trust. And maybe think of a code of conduct to explain in partnership with your stakeholders how you want to work, how you're going to get that data, how you're going to inform and consult with your employees, and just build trust through being as transparent as you can be. And then there are some more strategies, again, finding technology and data science solutions. We've seen that software developers are beginning to build compliance features into their products. We're starting to see more sophisticated encryption. And actually, Mary, I think you have an example of a very interesting company that is looking at sort of lava lamps in its...
Yeah, so this is a cloud storage company called Cloudflare. And in their lobby in the Silicon Valley or San Francisco, you walk in and there's a whole wall of those retro lava lamps. And you might think that's just a goofy, funny thing to have for decor, but they actually are continuously, those go 24/7. They're continuously recording, the movement of that lava, which is absolutely random. And they're using that to create an encryption tool to code data. And because it's random, nobody could know, hacker could predict it. And because, somebody could sneak into their office and photograph it, theoretically, they've actually also tied it to another off-site, other encryption method. But we're seeing companies talk about using blockchain. I think we're going to see more and more creative solutions that involve technology.
I think that's definitely. That's a message again from our research. Data is just so valuable. Companies and service providers will find ways.
Okay, shall we go on to the benefits? Okay, so we said that there's lots of things that would keep human capital analytics leaders up at night. I'll tell you quickly that years ago I was doing some research on human capital analytics and big data, and I had an opportunity at the outset of that research to talk to our Council of Chief Legal Officers and to get their input. And at the end of my description of the research, I said, so are you having these kinds of conversations with your CHRO or the head of human capital analytics? And there was this excruciatingly long silence. And I said, I'm guessing that you're not having these conversations. And one chief legal officer said, that's right. And as a result of this conversation, I'm going down the hall afterwards to talk to them. So I think there's been this way in which some of what HCA has been doing has been a little bit under the radar, not by design, but just that people weren't paying attention. And I think GDPR now has the opportunity both to raise the bar internally. As one HCA leader said to us, we've never bothered to tell people what we're doing with their data. But now we have a reason to do that, And we're going to have to get clearer, more sophisticated, and ensure our standards are. We've got more pressure, but more opportunity to, if you will, say, clean up our act or raise the bar. Companies also talked about this as reducing, let's say, some of the variability within the EU, and then for global companies, allowing them, as I think Merck has said, you said you've done, Leandra, is to establish some global standards using GDPR as the standard setter. I think a very important thing is in my story about the chief legal officer, human capital analytics was a little bit of a backroom operation. Perhaps risk, maybe data privacy, maybe, and certainly the chief legal officer didn't know anything about it. And GDPR raises the visibility and in some ways the stature of human capital analytics because there's more at stake. The board's going to want to hear about this. Your chief privacy officers, chief risk officer, chief legal officer are all going to want to be informed about this because the stakes are higher. And I think that is actually a good thing for the careers and the influence of human capital analytics leaders. And I also think that it's going to lead to greater investments in your systems, in your staff, in your skills, et cetera. So that's another good thing. And I think the other side of that is GDPR now gives human capital analytics greater leverage to say no to certain requests, because we often hear from our human capital analytics leaders that there are those requests that come down from on high, which you simply have to turn down because you say it's not ethical. And now GDPR, I think, gives you ammunition, if you will, a stronger argument for why it's not okay to do that. So those are all good things. And we're not trying to be Pollyannas here, but I think longer term, things don't look so bad. And that really longer term brings us to the last part, which is to talk about where we think all this is headed. What's the future in terms of data privacy and human capital analytics? And so I'm going to give Marion and Leander each a chance to talk about that, but I wanted to share with you a kind of big picture perspective that we developed in the course of our research. And that is to look at 6 forces that are simultaneously increasing over time, and that really creates the context or the environment in which all of you are going to be operating, and that you're going to need to be aware of and taking into account. And we hear about change occurring in geologic time, really, really slow. And this change is happening in digital time. I mean, it is so fast. So the 6 things we see as just progressing and having a lot of influence on the future. The first one is, there's greater and greater commercial value in data insights. The saying, data is the new oil. So data becomes both an input to better decisions and business development, but also it can become a product in and of itself. In addition, we see growing public concern about privacy. We all know about that. And we're talking this morning about tightening, and I think we'll see this around the world, regulations around data privacy. Those two are increasing. At the same time, human capital has got more sources of data, more ways of collecting it, and a greater volume of data, way more than it's ever had before. And at the same time, I think there's growing demand from business leaders for the kinds of insights that human capital analysts can deliver. So that too is increasing. And then finally, within human capital analytics team, there is growing acumen, maybe supplemented by greater technological ability, to do better analyses, to do more kinds of analyses, to collect more data. So you think about all 6 of these forces simultaneously, it creates both risk and opportunity. It creates and very challenging, interesting times for individuals and companies to navigate their way through these kinds of societal changes. So that's our big picture look. And then briefly, Leander, maybe we could start with you in terms of what you see in terms of the future of human capital analytics in face of data privacy concerns.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and really, I see it really as the right time that the topic GDPR is really suddenly on the agenda, not only for HR, but really for everyone in the business. And because really all these topics you just mentioned are really, yeah, coming or are already there. And this pressure that GDPR brought on being here on the agenda now really helps us actually to get ready in order to also, yeah, be up to speed with all the technologies and be ready from data privacy and legal terms, and also be able to actually look in these in a structured way and really in a consistent and standardized way. And having all these structures in place at Merck at least help us in order to go and open up the discussions. And a couple of topics that I see in HCA and that we are already today discussing at Merck is really, yeah, the next maturity level basically of HCA, looking, for example, into organizational network analysis, where we go beyond, internal HR data, but checking out, LinkedIn profiles, Outlook data, and any kind of other data in terms of networks. And on the other side, really looking at also, really stepping out of HR and infusing other data points in order to correlate data and even drive larger business impact with our data insights. So one project we are currently working on, for example, is really to combine sales data together with HR data in order to assess, our productivity and have really in-depth analysis and insights for sales managers at hand, and really to customize it even further and combine different data and to really generate much more outcome. And combined, in the best case, what we are also looking into is really looking also at new and advanced technologies like AI and machine learning that help us to assess all, this large, pot of data that we have today to drive the right insights, have personal insights and recommendations on the desk and at hand for every manager today. And this raises, of course, again, certain risks and data privacy discussion at a higher
Interesting times. Nobody's job's going to be boring. Yes. So Marion, I have to ask you to do this really quickly, but we want to hear from you in terms of what you think the future is going to be.
Well, I think just building on Leandra, the current situation we have is that human capital analytics is in a really interesting time. They're going to have to work in a different way. They're going to have to be stewards of data. And they're really going to, I think something that struck me is that companies, all these practitioners are really going to have to really engage with what privacy means, with what data protection and security means. Not just thinking legal compliance, but really getting to grips with what we as a society think, what our employees think. And so there is this much larger issue around data protection and privacy. So I think that for me is a big takeaway from our research. I think just practically what's ahead, more regulation, not just in the EU, but around the world. Definitely it's going to get tougher. And even just in the EU at the moment, we've got the e-privacy regulation coming along with its broader look on confidentiality of electronic communication. And then finally, as Leandra said, machine learning and AI, that's going to be a big challenge. And we're already seeing cloud-based machine learning as a service. And there is an issue of privacy of the training data. There is the issue about algorithms that obviously service operators want to keep quiet and keep private. And that whole area of transparency is a big issue. So very interesting times.
Yeah, I think transparency and trust are really the key here, because as the tools become more sophisticated, the amount of data becomes more, endless, and the potential is there. It's only by having built trust from stakeholders, with stakeholders, that companies will be able to tap into this. So that has to become a big part of the strategy. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We have questions we haven't been able to get to, but we'll try to follow up with you. But let me just close by giving you a link to this report that just came out. And there's also just a 2-page executive summary, but we hope you'll read the whole report because it has lots of really good examples in greater detail. And then I want to give you the heads up about next month's Human Capital Watch that will feature our colleague Chuck Mitchell and Gitanjali Gamel from Merck, who will talk. She's head of workforce planning and analytics, and they're going to be talking about frontline challenges for HR confronting changing nature of work in an era of digital transformation. So that is a kind of follow-on related to this. But in fact, I don't think we're doing any research in human capital on the conference board that isn't dealing with issues of data, privacy, and digital transformation. So we want to thank you. We also have a Human Capital Analytics Conference, I should say, coming up in October. GDPR is also on the agenda there. It's a great opportunity to learn from companies that have really advanced in human capital analytics, and they are all, of course, dealing with GDPR. And then finally, I'm going to just skip some of these, but say we really want your feedback. We have an evaluation form we send you immediately afterwards. We really pay attention to your comments and to your ratings. And so we hope you'll just take a moment to fill that out. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I always know it's a good webcast when I've learned things. And thanks to Leandra, I have. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye-bye.